Okay, so following the death of Darkseid, I wanted to do issue number 45 by itself, just because that would give us the ability to answer a lot of questions that you guys had down in the comments section. Chiefly among them, what's the difference between the Black Racer and the Black Flash? And what happens when guys like Darkseid die, right? New gods in general. Okay, so we're going to explain that over the course of the story. And what this does is this initially picks up with Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman all recognizing the fact that Darkseid is dead. But one of the things that you guys have probably noticed over the course of this is that at different points within the story, they've all kind of developed different powers in different ways. Batman has the Mobius chair, Superman has a whole new source of power, so on and so forth. But one of the things that goes on here is that even with that recognition, Wonder Woman says, since the day humans looked up to gods, they have wondered, can a god die? And so with Darkseid just laying there, scot-free asked the question, is it true, Mother Box? Is Darkseid truly dead? And the Mother Box says, yes, Darkseid is dead, Scott. You are free. And so Shazam and Cyborg and the rest of these guys kind of show up here, and Shazam asks the question. He says, shouldn't we be worried that the Anti-Monitor and his shadows up and disappeared? He and his crew did not stick around to gloat. And that's where Wonder Woman says, neither did Grail. When Darkseid fell, there was a blinding red light, a deafening sound, the ground shook, and then all was quiet. And if a god can die, what happens next? And that's where you switch over to Barry Allen, now possessed by the Black Racer. And Wonder Woman says, new gods are born. Now, here's the kind of kicker here, right? We do get a measure of an explanation about the nature of the Black Racer, but honestly, it's not overly complex. Instead, what ends up happening is that when Barry asks, did I kill Darkseid? That's when he's told, you didn't kill him, Flash. And so Barry just says, right, it was so awful. I could feel him die. I could see it. And again, that's where he's told by Scott-Free, the Black Racer did it, not you. And Wonder Woman asks, what or who is the Black Racer? And this is where we get a measure of an explanation here. The Scott-Free says, Darkseid's greatest weapon. He claimed he'd captured death, or an aspect of it, when he first took control of Apokolips, but death could only be communicated with by anchoring it to a sentient host. Darkseid may have summoned the Racer, but somehow the Anti-Monitor took control of it and forced you to bond with it, Flash. And so he tells Barry, right, I'm sorry, and Barry asks, like, why are you apologizing? And Scott says, because not even I could escape being fused with the Racer. Once a host is chosen, they are bound until, presumably, they die. And Barry just says, I'm not like the other hosts, and I don't want to escape death. I want to control it. That again sort of feeds into the nature of Barry Allen, specifically during Flashpoint, having to sacrifice the life of his mother in order to set the time stream back to where it's supposed to be. But let's have this conversation about Black Racer and Black Flash. So when it comes to the Black Racer, the Black Flash, any of these guys, they're all just kind of avatars, right? Representations or concepts of the very nature of dying itself. Death is an actual thing within DC Comics, an actual sentient entity called Death of the Endless. Not that dissimilar from Mistress Death within Marvel Comics. The difference here is that much like Mistress Death, or even Oblivion, if we want to use that as an example, there are various avatars of it that exist out there. For example, Hela within Marvel Comics is oftentimes considered to be an avatar of Mistress Death. And in fact, you could probably even go so far as to make arguments that different Hell Lords more or less function in the same way. I mean, Mephisto has actually encountered Mistress Death, and Mephisto does recognize Mistress Death as his superior. So, your mileage may vary on how direct of an analogy that may be. But essentially, Black Racer is the embodiment of death for new gods. But here's the thing to understand. New gods don't really die in the traditional sense, which is to say they pass on from old age or being physically destroyed and then just like go on to a higher state of entropy, right? Pass on into the quote-unquote afterlife. What actually happens with new gods is that because they are effectively immortal, in the New Gods miniseries, the explanation given to us was that when new gods die, they return to the source, which is quite literally the source of all creation. Within the context of that story, it was actually orchestrating the death of the new gods in order to move the fourth world into the fifth world. There wasn't really a whole lot doing in terms of like the progression of that storyline and the greater effect of DC Comics, but the fact is, right, they don't necessarily die per se. You could really look at the Black Racer as more of almost like a Grim Reaper, right, ferrying the spirits or the essences of new gods who die into the source itself. But when it comes to the Black Flash, that is the manifestation of death strictly for speedsters, right? So people who have the ability to tap into the Speed Force. The statement is true that speedsters didn't always have access to the Speed Force, which is to say it didn't always exist. In fact, the Speed Force was not introduced until Mark Waid's run on The Flash with, I believe, terminal velocity, but I'm not going to swear by that. Up until that, it was just different people accessing super speed through a variety of effects, right? Johnny Quick, Jesse Quick figured out a mathematical proof that allowed him to do that. Max Mercury got it from a Native American shaman. Barry Allen was doused with chemicals and struck by lightning. But the beauty of the Speed Force is that it's the theme that essentially unifies them all. And so when Barry Allen died, quote unquote, during Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then returned during Final Crisis and was being chased by what looks physically very similar to the Black Racer, it was actually the Black Flash. Yes, they look incredibly similar. Do not be afraid of the fact if you get the two of them confused. And so, with all that out of the way, this again focuses on the idea of Barry choosing to embrace the concept of death as opposed to running away from it. At that point, we switch over to Apokolips. In this particular instance, it's Lex Luthor and Superman. Now, as you see, Superman here is really kind of a on-the-nose representation of how his character had been handled over the course of the New 52, in the sense that he's very much reckless and kind of a dickhead, to be honest, very arrogant and caught up in himself in a variety of different ways. But one of the things that happens is he addresses Luthor, and he asks the question, can you hear that, Luthor? He says, I can. I can hear it across Apokolips. The mother boxes have told the slave masters. The slave masters told the slaves, and now everybody knows. Ding dong, the witch is dead. And he grabs Lex and just lifts him into the air. And Lex Luthor tries to plead here, right? He tells Superman, the energy from the pits, Superman, you need my help before it destroys your cells. And Superman just says, I don't need you for anything, Luthor. My cells are fine and charged with enough power to leave this festering hole of a world and go home. But you, Luthor, you're not going anywhere. And Superman just starts ripping his armor off of him. And he says, our long rivalry ends today. And Lex just asks, right? He just says, I admit it, Superman. Is that what you want? You could kill me anytime you wanted. You win. And the response of Superman? Of course I win. I'm Superman. Not that I think you'll last the night, Luthor, but a warning if you do. Never come back to Earth. If I see you again, you will end up like your armor. And literally just sends him flying and takes off. And so now Lex Luthor is just stranded on Apokolips. And again, while Darkseid himself is dead, it doesn't mean that Apokolips suddenly turns into this utopia. Green grass starts growing from the cracks and the sun rises for the very first time. No. Right? It's still a very hellish place to be in. It's still a very rough place. That life that all those people had to adopt to, and the mentalities and personalities that they have adopted as a result of that life, it doesn't just go away. And so when he's stranded there are suddenly all these lowlies that just come running up to him and realizing they've discovered a human, kind of these cast outs in Apokolips, doing what they can to literally avert the gaze of Darkseid before Darkseid died. And so that's when you switch over to Batman, and Batman's directly addressing Hal Jordan, and he says, Darkseid is dead. The war is over. It is time to go home. And Hal asks him, like, wait a second, Bats, what about the anti-monitor? And Batman just says, he touched the anti-life equation, Jordan. It turned him into that creature. Now that creature is gone, as if it never existed. The threat is over. I can turn my attention back to what's important. And he says, with the Mobius chair, I can finally be the Batman that Gotham City needs. But Hal Jordan knows that there's no way it's over that simple. It can't be one of these things where being as powerful as the Anti-Monitor kills Darkseid with the help of the Black Racer, and then suddenly the Anti-Monitor's just gone and the day is saved, and that's basically it. There's got to be more going on with that, which actually kind of makes sense, because as it stands right now, as far as Darkseid War goes, we're 5 issues in, and we're not even halfway done. And so Hal Jordan, right, he just says, if you were still the Bruce Wayne that I knew, you'd be skeptical about the idea that this was really over. And Bruce just says, it is, right? You need to go back to the core. And so that is where Hal just says, you have to get off of that chair. But then there's just this massive ping that goes on. And it's almost like this feedback for Hal Jordan. And Bruce just tells him, without Darkseid, the parademons are without their leader. They are roaming free out there in the universe. And like the insects they are drawn to a great place of power, the brightest light in the universe. And so that's when Hal realizes they're going after the central power battery on Oa. And so Batman just says, go and take care of your colleagues. With this chair, I can finally take care of mine. And so at that point, you jump back to Lex Luthor, where he's just kind of snatched up by all these people. And they just say, stand him up, right? Show respect. And he asks the question, who are you? And this girl just says, I'm Ardora, leader of the Forgotten People. And so Lex just asks, right, is that supposed to impress me? And she says, if you knew of us, it would. And so he just asks, right, what do you want with me? And she says, maybe nothing, maybe everything. And that's where you find out there's actually a lot going on here. It's a subplot, it's not overly huge, but it's interesting nonetheless, because she says, the blind prophet has written that in the night of Darkseid's death, a human would walk through the ashes of Apokolips, and everything would change. It was written that this human was a great hero from a place called Metropolis. He had saved his world many times. This man would bring the same hope he spread on his world to ours. He is an orphan, a humble son of farmers, seeker of truth and embodiment of justice. Are you this man? And of course, Lex lies and just says, yes, I am. And why wouldn't you, right? In facing what is most likely to be your execution, most people would say whatever they needed to say in order to stay alive. And so suddenly all these forgotten people start bowing to Lex Luthor. And in that moment, Ardora asks the question, why are you bowing before him? He has not earned it yet, and just shocks him. Now, what's also really interesting about the character of Ardora and the Forgotten People is, in addition to being tied into Jack Kirby's Fourth World, this is actually one of those instances where it hits on the idea that much like everything else across the cosmos, the New Gods are actually not immune to the crisis events and the resets of continuity. Metron is, right? Metron kind of exists outside of all of that, but Darkseid, Highfather, all those guys are effectively reset. And the reason why I say that is because this is not the first appearance of Ardora in Marvel Comics. In fact, she debuted in Superman issue number 167 and died in Action Comics 544. And in fact, Superman 167 came out in 1964, and Action Comics 544 was in 1983. So you're talking about a 19-year gap. What makes this so interesting is that in her original appearance, Ardora actually believed that Lex Luthor was a hero, and the two of them eventually got married at one point in time. The fact that she doesn't know who he is, that she doesn't recognize who Lex Luthor is, puts towards the idea that even if Crisis on Infinite Earths didn't necessarily reset her continuity, the effects of Flashpoint were so extreme that it reset everything in its entirety, top to bottom, which kind of makes sense because that's what Flashpoint was billed as. But more to the point, it looks to the idea that New Gods are not immune to the effects of continuity resets. Now, if we're talking about like Lucifer Morningstar or The Presence or somebody like that, sure. And oftentimes we just kind of have to wait until a story comes along that either confirms or denies the idea that they're affected by resets. This confirms that New Gods are, or at the very least, these guys, because Ardora is not Darkseid, and she's certainly not as powerful as he is. But the fact is, right, once you leave this, you jump back to Earth, and you focus on Barry Allen again. And that's where he's kind of asked the question, right? You're talking crazy, Flash. The racer is in your head. It's doing something to you. But Barry addresses Jessica Cruz, and he says, do not be frightened. If death didn't exist, we wouldn't be who we are. We wouldn't value life as we do. Don't you see? Death isn't evil. The darkness is calling them home, a chill, an echo, a shadow cast, but always remembered. Death never stops chasing you. You cannot escape it. I thought differently, but it's there. We will all die someday, maybe even today. But that's where Barry starts to conflict with it, right? So you basically have two mentalities going on at the same time. The Barry Allen persona actually rejects this and says, no, this isn't right. And Black Racer says, death comes for everyone. The old, the young, it's what makes life precious. And Barry just tells it, right? Get out of my head. And Black Racer just says, you cannot outrun death. And Barry just says, I can try, and takes off as fast as he can, which technically he has. But the Black Racer is not entirely wrong. Black Racer, in making this case that life life only matters because it can end. That's a true statement, right? The moments that we spend with people, the conversations that we have, the people we fall in love with and out of love with, those are all important. One, because we know we will lose those people at some point along the line, and those memories will be the only thing that we have to reflect back on. But two, because we will leave somewhere along the line, and we want to make sure that we leave something positive behind in the world. Whether it's affecting one person's life or affecting the entire world, we want to remember and to impact the world in a positive way. So it's only because of death that life has any meaning or any value whatsoever. So it's not to say that death is something that should be embraced. It's really just that death in and of itself is the reason why life matters. And so at that point, you switch over to Shazam. And Shazam just says, we should all be concerned by that, right? I'm not nearly as fast as Flash, but I bet Cyborg can track him. But in the midst of this statement, suddenly he starts hearing these voices, right? I will not give my power to this boy, wizard. And another voice says, he will be my vessel. And then a third voice says, he will burn like all Martians. Another voice says, the source wall will not stand for long. And so finally this voice chimes back in and says, Billy, listen to me. The new gods call to you. And Billy Batson freaks out and takes off. And so then you just kind of have Cyborg, who's like, I hear voices, right? I heard voices talking to him. Did anybody else hear that? But Wonder Woman just kind of ignores it and says, we need to split up, right? Some of us go after Shazam. The others have to go after Flash. But again, at that point, the statement's made, Darkseid's dead. That's supposed to be a good thing. But what did his death actually mean? What is going on with everybody? And so that's where Kalibak and his forces show up and simply say, that's not your concern. Your concern is us, which is a far more significant concern than you think it is. And so in that moment, you switch back over to Lex Luthor, and Lex is told, wake up, right? And Lex is kind of like, doesn't really have his bearings, trying to figure out what's going on. And that's where Adora tells him, you have claimed to be this hero, the chosen one, to lead Apokolips to a new age. With Darkseid's death, his Omega effect has been released, essentially the source of Darkseid's power. It will return here to Apokolips. We will contain it in you. And Lex initially rejects this, not in a flat out, don't touch me, get this away from me, more like, wait, I didn't understand what's going on here. But Adora just says, if you are a hero worthy of this power as you claim, you will survive. If not, you will die. And so that's where somebody calls out to her and says, Adora, I see a red star. And she says, not a red star, the Omega effect. It returns. The test is now human, and Lex Luthor is just blasted with the full totality of this Omega effect of Darkseid. And so that's when you switch over to Grail and her mother, and we find out what's going on with the Anti-Monitor, because her mother asks her, right, where is the Anti-Monitor? And Grail just says, he's in the shadows, mother, he is changing. And her mother just says, he's becoming Mobius, right? She recognizes what's actually happening. And that's where Grail says, yes, he will reveal himself to us. And then I get what I want. And so that's when you switch back to Lex, and he just says, Darkseid is dead. Long live Lex Luthor. And Lex becomes the god of Apokolips. And so from here, what ends up happening, as you've noticed, these different heroes are all gaining new abilities. And so what it does is it starts spinning out into a series of one-shots. Batman, the god of knowledge, Superman, the god of strength, Shazam, the god of gods, Green Lantern, the god of light, Flash, the god of death. It focuses on these one-shot stories that kind of deal with them coming to terms with their own abilities and how they can use them. Some of them are really cool. Some of them kind of suck. I will leave it up to you guys to let me know whether or not you want me to cover them. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. This is officially the end of Darkseid War Act 1. Following this, we go into the second half of the story, which is the return of the Anti-Monitor and his new form. Because I'm going to tell you guys right now, the Anti-Monitor looks amazing, and this guy's level of power is insane. But thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.